Hello, and welcome to Book 4. Tonight we talk to Raymond Williams about his new novel, Loyalties. Raymond Williams comes from a Welsh border working-class family and until 1983 was Professor of Drama at Cambridge University. He's one of England's leading socialist writers and is probably best known for his political and cultural investigations into this country's past, present and future, culture and society, the long revolution, which leads us up to Britain in the 1960s, and towards 2000, which sets out the choices facing our civilization if it is to survive. But he's also the author of books on drama, on English fiction, on the media and on language. And he's written 4 other novels, a trilogy set in Wales and a political thriller called The Volunteers. Loyalties, which begins in 1936 and ends in 1984, connects the Welsh mining villages, the Spanish Civil War and Cold War espionage with Williams's persistent theme, how do personal politics affect our society? Raymond Williams, your novel is called Loyalties. In a recent book, Towards 2000, you discuss the word loyalty and you talk about the way in which the word has become misused and the concept has become manipulated. Can you say why you called this book, with this keyword, the title Loyalties?
Well, it's a novel about a group of people who, from 1936 through to 1984, relate to each other and to what's happening in their time, first as young people and then in some cases through their children and even to their grandchildren. They make different choices, they are involved in difficult relationships with each other and they go in very different directions. And about one of them specifically, it's part of the mystery of the book to know which and how. In one of them, the question of loyalty in quite the simplest sense, obeying the orders of your own country, loyal in that sense to a nation, does come up in a very problematic way, that one of them is thought to be a spy. And the point I wanted to make, since the interest was in the development of this whole group, that what's involved in that sort of process is not just one loyalty, one meaning of loyalty and one way of looking at whether people are loyal or disloyal in those terms, but all the range of loyalties, loyalties plural, loyalties to each other, loyalties to ideas, loyalties to your own people, loyalties to your country and causes and so on.
2 of these characters, Norman and Emma, are upper-class English characters who are communists. Emma goes on being a sort of hardline communist all her life in a rather blinkered way, and Norman is the character who, if I can say this, is thought to be the spy. Is one of the cruxes of the book the idea of the upper-class communists betraying the working-class socialists?
Well, the novel certainly puts that question. I mean, I think that in that formation and generation, what was done in good faith within those terms, you know, the belief that it would be in the interest of the working people to have that kind of politics and that kind of allegiance, I think in the end it was at best an error and at worst a disloyalty. And which it is. I mean, this is one of the problems. Are they simply mistakes of judgment or are they acts of deliberate bad faith and deception? I think that the question is put in a rather hard way because usually it's put the other way round, that those people who have been left idealists are prone to complain that the working class has let them down by not sufficiently supporting them, which is not what I believe.
Norman is accused by Gwyn, who's in fact his son, at the end of the book, although his son has been brought up in this Welsh mining village, of having betrayed the working classes. And the son, Gwyn, makes a connection, a rather surprising connection, between the activity of the upper-class spies, I mean, familiar figures in our culture, and the public attitudes towards the socialist movement in this country. So that it's as if he's saying that someone like, say, Anthony Blunt is indirectly responsible for the failure of the miners' strike because of the sorts of attitudes to communism that he's produced. Is that right? Is that the argument of the book?
No, I don't think it's that so much. I think it is simply that if you associate socialism as an entirely native growth of this country and this people, which it is. I mean, it occurred in this country before there was communism and before there was Marx. If you associate that with a particular 20th century version, which inevitably involves attitudes to the Russians or to the Communist Party or something, then you are making an association which is in fact destructive. Because a lot of people can't think about socialism in this country now without, almost as a knee-jerk response, thinking about Russians and thinking about communists. Or they have to pretend that socialism is really some very mild thing, which doesn't mean very much, you know, which can therefore be safely accommodated. I'm saying that the people who made that association, well, this is Gwyn's argument. I'm not wholly underwriting it. The people who made that association did damage because a wholly native thing got associated with something which was, even in the best sense, alien.
You say you're not completely underwriting the attitude of one of your characters. I wondered actually to what extent you were in sympathy or in understanding with the upper class communist characters.
Well, I decided to write the book in a very particular way. First, in episodes which, because they don't have a simple narrative continuity, don't have the effect of leading the reader towards one kind of judgment of what's been happening. If you have a certain narrative continuity, the narrative itself tells you what to think at the end, by what it arrives at. And the second thing is that there's a very deliberate shift from seeing a particular scene from point of view of one character or another. I mean, many novels which are quite impersonally written, nevertheless, are seeing the events through one leading mind, one leading personality. Now, I deliberately didn't do this. On the contrary, I wanted it to be seen from many different points of view, because I think that in that sense it is open. And the last words of the book, open questions, I mean, really, my position, if it comes to it. I mean, I try to go through the experiences and I try to include the arguments. But I am not underwriting anybody in it. I mean, there's nobody there who is me. The character of Norman in the book is both personally and politically treacherous. Do those two things go together, do you think? I don't think they necessarily go together. They do in that personality, but I mean, for example, his sister Emma is, in her lights, a notably loyal person. She goes on caring and taking her responsibilities as she sees them very seriously. But there's an identification of personal betrayal of human beings with the sort of person who is going to be a traitor, in inverted commas, in another sense. Well, I think this has been the agony of some people in this century, that they have sometimes thought that to serve a cause they've had to betray a person. And I think that, I know what I think about that, but I think it can't be reduced to something very, very simple. I think that there obviously are personalities who are more capable of sustained deception than others, and almost by definition, the character playing this role has to be capable of sustained deception. Whether it necessarily goes on into personal life, I think that people can often be loyal to a few people very close to them, but disloyal in a larger way. Again, I come back to saying loyalty is plural. I mean, if we knew what it was as a simple quantity, that people wouldn't be so difficult to judge. You don't think there's a danger of identifying disloyalty with a sort of metropolitan, sophisticated, highly educated upper-class type, and loyalty with the solid working-class Welsh mining community? If there were such a danger, I wouldn't be greatly worried by it. I mean, I think that since it will not be believed, I mean, by the people who identify themselves that way. No, I don't think that. I think it is simply that if you are in a working community and you haven't got the kind of mobility, which by the definition of the nature of their jobs and education, those people have, you know that your present and future is going to be where you are and what happens to your neighbors. I mean, you cannot in the same way see a destiny or a career as something which you can consider in your own terms. And I think in that sense, I mean, people talk about the other side of it, that it's very restrictive and narrow and that you're pushed into certain narrow ways, and we've had a lot of people celebrating breaking away from that. I think it's a small price to pay for the kind of continuity which, in the end, I mean, to me, is a sane politics, that you either get your own place, your own people right, or there aren't any politics. I mean, the other kind of politics is very intellectually interesting, but not, I think, very pertinent.
It's interesting because the contrast that you're making seems partly to be one between the past and the future, in the sense that a lot of the feeling about the Welsh mining community in the book is not exactly nostalgic, but there's a sense that these values are passing or are under threat, whereas the world of paper and money, as you put it, which is the world that threatens them, is, as it were, the world of the future, the world that's coming. So are one's feelings about, or are your feelings about the Welsh community, the mining community, very much feelings attached to the past?
Well, I think not at all. I think this is the danger. I mean, inevitably, if you want to look at examples of people who have been true to each other and who have acted in something which could be said to be the general human interest, I mean, you're going to find your examples of the past. If you talk about this in the future, it sounds like so much rhetoric, you know, especially since there's now a heavy campaign to discount notions like loyalty, public interest, common interest. There's tremendous cultural pressure on it. But my position is that if we can understand how people went wrong in these ways, how a particular generation lost its way, I mean, or some of them did, how certain things were underestimated, how certain false connections were made, then those resources are still there. I mean, this is entirely not a book which is arguing that the world of paper and money is going to take over. I mean, it's immensely powerful.
It's not only paper and money, it's also technology, isn't it? It's
right.
Interesting that these spies of yours are technological spies. They're
right.
involved in information technology. Why do you think that's so crucial as something to explore, something to talk about?
Well, I mean, I wanted a plot which was not simply rehearsing the secrets of the atom bomb, which, I mean, both because it's familiar and because it seems to me, in one way, genuinely less interesting. The things which are changing this world, I mean, in extending the scale of fact and knowledge that people need to know, not only to be loyal, but to live at all, these things are in that technology, and therefore it interests me very much to put these people in that world, where they do see, even the weakest of them see, that this is something that's going to change the world at the public level, which it's doing. And then in a way that the whole question of secrets and loyalty should be fought out about that is to me extraordinarily important, because the fight over the new technology is precisely a fight over whether it's going to be used to control people, or, as I've argued against most of my radical friends, whether this technology is at last the possibility of a publicly informed and free society. So the irony of them working in that is deliberate. It's where the whole question of secrets arises.
Yes, and it's part of your whole argument against what you call technological determinism.
Exactly, that it doesn't have to be that sort of secret, manipulative world. It very easily becomes it, because those are the people who control it.
In this novel, Loyalties, and in a recent novel, The Volunteers, in both these novels there's a process of investigation going on, and it's an investigation of the past. There's a central character who has to find out something about the past, and that process is described as a kind of harrowing. You use the same word in both books. I wondered what the force of that metaphor was for you, and why you're so interested in this process of investigating the past.
Well, one thing, I mean, one of the motives for writing this book was to see what happens to a group of people who at a certain time in their lives think they've got a lot in common, and then, as history happens, they grow up differently, and it tends not to be critical because they lose touch with each other and so on. What one notices about the individuals within those groups I don't say this unkindly. I mean, I've seen it in all sorts of people who I like, and I've seen it in myself, is that as things change, people are extraordinarily good at incorporating the past, you know, in an acceptable version, and they make a story out of their lives which is that much more acceptable. Now, that's what interested me, to have a case of somebody who, on the record, which someone else could find out, had lived in such a way which, if it came to it, couldn't be denied. He had a past in the literal sense, that you've got a past which other people can prove. Most of us have pasts which, you know, don't get in that way investigated. I mean, I think that people cannot lie to themselves about the past, nor can they ever understand the way the society is going. If I remember first noticing this about 1938, which is, after all, roughly when the novel starts, speaking as a schoolboy in Abergavenny Market against the Munich Agreement and being howled down. And I was, 17, and I didn't know much about it, but I remember being howled down. What interested me in the 50s was that everybody who'd been alive at that time was against the Munich Agreement, because by that time it was a thing to do to be against it.
So you're talking about processes of political change that get pasted over as well
as personal things, yes. Because I think all that happens that he forgets. I mean, in a way, it seemed to me very significant that when, by accident, Norman and Nesta, who had a child, meet years later after the separation, or at least are in the same room, she recognizes him, he doesn't recognize her. I mean, in a sense, the kind of, even that, I mean, the physical contact between
yes.
people who've been that close and knowing their own past.
You need fiction to write about these subjects, do you?
Absolutely.
These are subjects which have to be done fictionally.
Entirely, because, I mean, it is an argument which involves too much experience to be done in the, you know, largely impersonal mode, which is proper for argument. I write both kinds.
Yes, it's interesting because a question arises about why you choose to write fiction, in that very often, it seems to me, your characters are there to present political positions, and sometimes their dialogue is a little bit wooden, I think, in that sense. I mean, they say things to each other like, what you did was an alien variation within the norms of your own class, and you sit back and think, well, do people really talk to each other?
Well, people I know
like
do.
This? They do.
I mean, not all people do, but people to whom ideas are important do. And I think that this is one of the points. If they were simple arguments, then they would be written as argument.
When the people are speaking, they often sound alike, or it seems as if their voices are being used in order to utter ideas and arguments and statements which perhaps, you know, in your own voice could have been more directly...
Well, if you read it like that, I don't find their voices similar. I mean, the Welsh people are always speaking differently, for example, and putting it in a different way. And I mean, I think people tend to hurry over the early episodes. I mean, after all, the fighting in the Spanish War, the fighting in Normandy, these are things which happen and are not spoken about. This is precisely areas of silence. And I think this is, again, one of the points, that many of the big things do happen in it, but they are areas of silence. And the arguments are not certainly ones I have with myself, I mean, which would be another kind of writing. They are where people from quite different positions are arguing for the choices they've made.
Very often you project, as it were, a double sense of a person into two people in the novel, the person who stays or the person who goes away, or you have two political attitudes being projected into two different characters in your books.
But not only political attitudes, because, I mean, I think, you see, for most people, this is a difference between some of the characters in Loyalties. I think for most people in border country, to go back that far, somebody says the only real politics is politics on a weekly wage. I mean, that is a different kind of politics from people having political opinions, reading political newspapers and going to Parliament or something. I do believe, given the nature of the 20th century, that what is abstracted as politics is a far more intimate part of many people's lives. Not that they want to take part in its processes, but I do believe that the public crises work their way into people's psyche, whether they act on them or not. And particularly, I think, for my generation, which after all grew up into a war, the notion that there is some separate thing called politics which you have ideas about is incomprehensible, because politics came and called you up and sent you to France, and politics pushed you out again and into a bewildering post-war world. And
do you see yourself as writing a kind of fiction which takes on board the important things that are happening in the world, as opposed to a sort of fiction that does not do that, which is private or fragmented or too personal?
Well, I mean, the history of this generation has been one in which to isolate an area of private life which is possible is the thing that has to be justified. The set of the culture is that you have to justify writing about the history which has broken into everybody's lives because of certain assumptions. What's now got to be justified is being able to live on the blessed island of private relationships between a few people, because historically that has always been associated with a certain kind of privilege which is never included even in the private relationships. It isn't that I would feel hostile to that kind of fiction. I'm just very surprised that people can do it in the sort of world we've had, in which the private life is literally picked up and put down somewhere else by war, by unemployment, by what it may be. This is very difficult to communicate to people who, even within all the rough political problems and constraints of the last 20 years, have never in that sense just had politics pick them up and move them around.
Which happened to you.
Well,
I mean, I wonder to what extent the writing of these fictions is a way of, as opposed to the writing of essays, is a way of being able to project your own, perhaps, ambivalences about, for instance, having gone away from a working-class Welsh childhood and become a professor at Cambridge, in a way belonging to two classes.
Well, I mean, project ambivalences, I mean, I would be sorry if it were that. I mean, certainly explore them. I mean, but, I mean, I've never thought that this was anything very special and personal to me. I mean, that was precisely why I kept rewriting Border Country. It had been a very simple novel to write as a bright boy who goes from the village school to Cambridge. The reality is that the people are still there. They are adults. The childhood world is not the same. And the more you see this, the more you realize that to reduce it to your personal history that really would be to betray it. Although so many contemporary fictional forms say, please, please reduce it to a personal history, because then it would be the kind of novel we're used to. I say that it is precisely that this is not only, of course it is also, a personal history. And it's at that level one can connect with people who haven't had that particular history. I mean, on the working class thing. About the war, I think that may be more difficult.
So the novel for you is a form of connecting, making connections.
Of connecting and exploring and of seeing what happens when you don't arbitrarily divide people's lives up into the personal and the social and the intellectual and so on, but when they all go on as they do in fact in one dimension.
Thank you. Loyalties and the Volunteers are published this month by Chatto and Windus and the Hogarth Press. Next week, Book 4 goes to Cambridge to talk to the poet Geoffrey Hill, whose collected poems have just been published in Penguin. Until then, goodbye.
Book 4 next week will be at the earlier time of 10.